It was Christmas afternoon when Thomas Walker came home from work and heard something impossible. His daughters laughing, real laughter, the kind he thought disappeared forever when their mother died, and he stood completely still in the hallway, too scared to move because in 18 months he had never heard that sound, not even once. Thomas Walker was 45 years old, a man who built a very successful computer company from nothing and became super rich, but none of his money could save his family from the sadness that came after his wife Rachel died in a terrible car accident 18 months ago on Highway 2 when a person who had been drinking drove through a red light and hit her car, and she died before the ambulance could get there, leaving behind 3-year-old twin daughters Emma and Lily, tiny girls who couldn't understand where their mommy went and who changed from sweet little kids into angry storms that nobody could calm down. The twins bit babysitters, screamed until their throats hurt, and broke everything they could reach, and 8 different helpers quit in just 6 weeks, with some lasting only 3 days and one not even making it past breakfast time. Thomas tried everything he could think of, including taking them to doctors who work with kids' feelings, special teachers, and experts who promised they had seen worse problems than this. But nothing worked at all, and his house became like a war zone with no happiness, no laughter, just 2 broken little girls and a dad who didn't know how to help them feel better. Then 5 days ago, a woman showed up at his front door named Sarah Miller, who was 28 years old and wanted to work as a housekeeper through an agency, and she didn't have any special training for taking care of children, just a quiet strength about her and eyes that looked like she had known deep sadness herself. Thomas almost didn't give her the job because her experience seemed wrong, but when you feel like you're drowning in problems, you grab any hand that reaches down to help you, so he told her she could try for 1 week, just 1 week like everyone else, and she nodded and said okay, 1 week. The twins attacked her on the first day, testing her, pushing her, trying to make her quit like they had made everyone else quit, but Sarah didn't run away or give up, she stayed, and today, Christmas afternoon on day 5, Thomas left work early because something pulled him home even though he couldn't explain what it was. When he opened his front door, the house felt different, warmer and quieter, and then he heard voices, soft voices, coming from the living room, and his heart started beating really fast as he moved toward the sound, with each step feeling heavier than the last because he was terrified of what he might find and terrified of hoping that things might actually be getting better. When he reached the living room doorway and looked inside, what he saw brought him to his knees with tears in his eyes because his daughters were sitting on the floor with Sarah, all of them surrounded by his wife Rachel's old Christmas decorations that he had packed away because looking at them hurt too much, and Sarah was holding up ornaments one by one and telling the girls stories about their mother, and the twins were listening. Really listening with faces that looked peaceful and open, instead of angry and closed off like they had been for so long. 5 days earlier on Monday morning, Thomas woke up to the sound of glass breaking in the kitchen, and he didn't move, just lay there staring at the ceiling and listening to the crashes, and then Emma's voice being bossy even though she was only 3 years old, and then Lily screaming that high, loud scream that used to make the neighbors call the police, and it was only 6:45 in the morning but the fighting had already started. He should get up, he knew that, but his body felt so heavy and tired, and this used to be the time when Rachel would come into their room with coffee, humming a song while she poured it, kissing his forehead and making him smile before the day even began. But now he reached for her side of the bed and found it cold and empty like it had been for 18 months, even though he still reached for her every single morning. Downstairs something else crashed, even louder this time, so Thomas finally got up, got dressed, and walked down the stairs feeling like he was walking to something terrible, and when he got to the kitchen it looked like a bomb had exploded with cereal scattered everywhere, milk dripping on the floor, and bowls thrown all over the place. Sitting on the table next to some keys was a folded piece of paper, and he didn't need to read it because he already knew what it would say, but he opened it anyway and read the words from the latest babysitter saying she was sorry but she couldn't do this anymore, and his daughters needed more help than she could give them, and please don't contact her. Her name was Susan or maybe Sarah. Thomas couldn't remember anymore because they all blurred together after a while, and this made 8 people who had quit. So he opened the drawer beside the sink, the one that used to hold Rachel's recipes, and placed the letter inside with all the others, a whole drawer full of letters from people who had looked at his daughters and walked away. He couldn't even feel angry anymore, just tired, the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix no matter how much you rest. The twins were in the living room, and Emma sat on the couch with her arms crossed, watching him with eyes that looked too old for her little face, eyes that looked just like Rachel's eyes, while Lily was pulling books off the shelf one by one and letting them hit the floor with loud thuds. She left, Emma said, and it wasn't a question, so Thomas just nodded his head, and Emma said good because she yelled too much, and Thomas said that was because you bit her, Emma. But his daughter just shrugged with no feeling sorry at all, no guilt, just cold acceptance that this was how things worked now, where people came and people left, and nobody stayed for very long. Thomas looked at them, really looked at them carefully, and saw Emma with her mother's face and a heart that had frozen shut from sadness, and Lily with his own stubbornness twisted into anger. Two tiny girls who had learned that loving people meant losing them, so they stopped letting anyone get close enough to hurt them again. His phone buzzed with a message from work saying he had a meeting in 1 hour, another day of pretending he had everything together while his home fell apart into pieces, so he grabbed his briefcase, kissed both girls on the head even though Emma went stiff and Lily flinched away, and he walked out the door feeling like a failure. That evening when he came home, his assistant Mike was waiting in the driveway, and the look on Mike's face made Thomas's stomach drop with worry, and Thomas said, "Let me guess, no one else will take the job," but Mike said actually the agency has someone but she's different, and different was code word for desperate. She's been working as a housekeeper for years with no formal training for taking care of children, Mike explained, and Thomas asked then why are they sending her, and Mike hesitated and looked down at the folder in his hands and said she heard about your situation and specifically requested this position because she said she understands what your daughters are going through. Thomas almost laughed because everyone thought they understood until they actually met Emma and Lily, so he asked what her name was, and Mike said Sarah Miller, and handed him a folder with her application, work history, cleaning houses, and references from families she had worked for, nothing special, nothing that explained why someone with zero experience with kids would volunteer for this impossible job. Then Thomas saw the photo clipped to the front page, and something about her face stopped him cold because her eyes had something in them, something that looked like deep sadness, and he had seen that look before in his own mirror every single morning for 18 months because it was grief, raw and fresh, like she had lost someone recently too. Thomas told Mike to schedule the interview for 9 o'clock the next morning, and Mike nodded and left, and Thomas stood there in his driveway holding that folder and staring at Sarah Miller's face because something wasn't adding up, since housekeepers didn't usually look like that with eyes that carried that much pain, and they didn't specifically request positions with traumatized children. So who was she really, and why did looking at her photo make his chest feel tight with something he couldn't name or understand? Tuesday morning at exactly 9 o'clock the doorbell rang, and Thomas's stomach twisted because he had barely slept, kept thinking about that photo and those sad eyes that looked like they had seen the same darkness he had seen. He opened the door and Sarah Miller stood on his doorstep wearing a simple white shirt and dark pants that were pressed carefully but worn soft from years of use, and she carried one small bag, just one, and a Bible that looked like it had been read so many times the cover was coming loose at the edges. But it was her face that stopped him because she wasn't smiling that fake bright smile most people wore when they met him, wasn't trying to look confident or put together, she just looked steady like she had already made peace with whatever was about to happen. She said Mr. Walker quietly, and he said come in, but she didn't move yet, just stood there looking up at his house with her eyes moving across the windows and the door and the stone steps, taking it all in and really seeing it. And then she closed her eyes and Thomas watched confused as her lips started moving with no sound, just silent words. And her hand came up and rested over her heart because she was praying right there on his doorstep in the cold December air, and he didn't know what to do or where to look. After a long moment Sarah opened her eyes and looked at him, really looked, not at his house or his money or his reputation but at him as a person, and she said softly, "I'm ready now," and then she stepped inside. Thomas led her to his office and offered her a seat and started to give his usual speech about the twins and the job and what to expect, but Sarah spoke first and said, "Mr. Walker, can I ask you something before we begin?" And he paused and said sure. And she asked how did your wife die? And the question hit him like a punch to the stomach because most people avoided it, danced around it, pretended not to know about it. Car accident, Thomas said with his voice flat and emotionless. Highway 2, 18 months ago. The girls were barely 2 years old, and Sarah's face went very still and something flickered in her eyes that looked like pain and recognition and something he couldn't name. She said, and you've been carrying this alone since then. And it wasn't a question but a statement. And Thomas felt something crack in his chest because this woman he had known for 30 seconds had just spoken the truth no one else dared to say out loud. I've tried everything, he heard himself admit. Therapists, specialists, babysitters with every credential you can imagine. Nothing works, my daughters are. And he stopped because he hated the words but needed to say them. They're breaking everything. 8 people have quit. Some lasted 3 days. I don't know what else to do anymore. Sarah was quiet for a moment, and then she leaned forward slightly and said, Can I be honest with you, Mr. Walker? And he said, Please. And she said, I don't think your daughters are out of control. I think they're drowning. And drowning people fight the hardest against the hands trying to pull them up because they don't trust anyone anymore, and they're scared. Thomas stared at her because 6 therapists hadn't been able to say what this housekeeper just did in one sentence, and Sarah continued with her voice gentle, saying there's a difference between fixing and healing. Fixing is about making things easier for us, but healing is about making things whole for them, and whole takes time and patience. Thomas said, I can give you 1 week to see if you can handle them. And Sarah smiled, but there was something sad in it. Something that looked like she knew a secret he didn't. And she said, I don't need a week to know if I can handle them, Mr. Walker. I need a week to start earning their trust because trust takes time. Before Thomas could respond, a crash came from upstairs, loud and deliberate, and then Lily's scream, the one that meant someone was about to get hurt or break something. And Thomas closed his eyes and said, That's them. And Sarah said quietly, I know. And she stood up, smoothed her shirt, picked up her Bible, and asked, Should we go meet them? And Thomas said, You don't want to run away first. And she looked at him with those haunted sad eyes and said softly, Mr. Walker, I didn't come here to run, I came here to stay. Something about the way she said it, like she wasn't just talking about the job but talking about something bigger, something he couldn't see yet, made Thomas's heart start racing. So who was this woman really, and why did it feel like she had been waiting her whole life to walk through his door? They walked toward the noise together, and with each step closer the sounds got worse with crashing and screaming, the kind of chaos that makes your chest feel tight with worry. And the playroom door was open, so Thomas stopped at the doorway because he had seen this before 8 times, but it never got easier to watch. The room looked like a disaster area with toys scattered everywhere, books torn apart with pages everywhere, curtains pulled down, a lamp knocked over, and crayon marks on the walls spelling words he didn't want to read, and in the center of it all were his daughters looking like tiny warriors. Emma stood in front with her arms crossed and her chin up, 3 years old but already acting like a general in charge, and Lily was beside her with her fists clenched and ready to fight, and they had done this before, knew exactly what they were doing, showing the new person what they were walking into and waiting for the shock and the fear in the moment when the adult's face changed and they realized they had made a mistake coming here. But Sarah didn't gasp or step back or look at Thomas for help. She just walked into that destroyed playroom slowly and looked at the torn books and the marker on the walls and the 2 small faces daring her to judge them, and then she smiled, not a fake smile or a nervous smile but a real smile that was warm, like she had just walked into something beautiful instead of something broken. What are you smiling at? Emma demanded suspiciously, and Sarah said simply, At you too, and Lily snapped back, We're not cute, we're horrible, everyone says so. But Sarah tilted her head slightly and said, Then everyone must not be looking very closely because I see 2 brave girls who are hurting inside. The twins exchanged confused glances because what kind of trick was this? And then Sarah did something that stopped them both completely. She knelt down, got down on her knees on that messy floor so she was at their level, eye to eye with them, and she looked at Emma first, really looked like she could see past the crossed arms to the scared girl underneath, and then at Lily, past the anger to the pain. You are not too much, Sarah said quietly and clearly, you are not too broken, and you are not unlovable, no matter what anyone has made you feel, and the words hung in the air like magic. Emma's arms dropped slightly, and she said you don't know us. And Sarah agreed and said not yet, but I'd like to if you'll let me. And Lily opened her mouth and Thomas recognized it as the pre-scream breath, the one that meant 6 hours of screaming was about to start, and make everyone miserable. But before the sound could come out, Sarah started humming, low and gentle, an old melody, the kind that sounds like safety and home and warmth, and she stood up slowly, still humming, and began picking up toys one at a time with no rush, no urgency, just steady movement and that soft, unafraid sound. Lily's mouth stayed open but no scream came out, and the twins just stared because nobody had ever hummed before, nobody had ever just started cleaning without yelling first about the mess they made. I think this room is messy, Sarah said softly between hums, because your hearts are messy, and that's okay, messy hearts just need time and patience to get clean again. And she picked up a stuffed elephant and set it gently on the shelf, and it was Lily's favorite elephant, the one Rachel used to read stories to at bedtime. You knew our mama? Lily asked suddenly with her voice small and different from her angry voice, and Sarah's hand stopped for a beat too long before she answered carefully. I knew a lot about her, she sounded like an amazing person. Thomas's chest tightened because something in the way Sarah said it was strange, not I heard she was but she sounded like, as if Sarah had actually heard Rachel talk and like they had spoken to each other. But that was impossible because he had never met Sarah before in his life. Before he could process this strange feeling, Emma walked over to Sarah and reached out with one small hand and touched the hem of her sweater, testing it, seeing if she was real and not going to disappear, and Sarah looked down and smiled warmly and said, "Hi, sweetheart." Emma didn't answer, just held on to Sarah's sweater like Sarah was an anchor keeping her safe in a storm. And Thomas stood there in the doorway watching his daughter who hadn't let anyone touch her in 18 months now holding on to a stranger's sweater like her life depended on it. So who was Sarah Miller really, and how did she know anything about Rachel at all? That afternoon Thomas watched from the kitchen doorway as Sarah sat on the floor with the twins, not forcing anything or making them do activities, just being present with them, and Emma had crawled into her lap without being asked while Lily sat close with their shoulders touching. And they weren't talking, just sitting together in the quiet feeling safe. Then Sarah started humming again, that same melody from earlier, soft and steady. And Thomas's blood went cold with shock because that song, that specific song, was Rachel's song, the one she hummed while making breakfast every morning, the one she sang to the girls when they were babies, the one that died with her and nobody else should know. How do you know that song? Thomas asked. And his voice came out sharper than he meant it to because he was confused and a little scared, and Sarah's humming stopped immediately, and she turned to look at him, and Thomas saw something flash across her face that looked like fear and guilt, and something else. It's just an old song, she said quickly, my grandmother used to sing it, but her eyes told a different story because she was lying and Thomas could tell. Lots of people know it, Sarah added with her voice too casual now, trying to sound normal. But Thomas noticed everything and he saw through her act. Girls, Thomas said while keeping his eyes on Sarah, why don't you go play in the other room for a bit? And Emma looked up at him confused and said, but we're being good. And Thomas said, I know, baby. I just need to talk to Sarah for a minute. So Lily stood up reluctantly and Emma followed slowly, like they were afraid Sarah might disappear if they looked away for too long. When the girls were gone, Thomas stepped into the room and said quietly, that song was my wife's song, she sang it every morning, every night before bed. How do you know it? And Sarah stood up slowly with her hands shaking, and Thomas said, don't lie to me again, please. She looked at him for a long moment with something in her face breaking apart, and she said softly, I told you the truth, my grandmother did sing it, but that's not the only place I heard it from. And Thomas's heart was pounding hard now, and he asked, where else did you hear it? Sarah opened her mouth, closed it, looked away, and said, I'm not ready to tell you yet. And Thomas asked, did you know Rachel? And the question hung between them like smoke in the air. Sarah's eyes filled with tears and she didn't answer, but her silence said everything Thomas needed to know, and he whispered, oh my God, you knew her, you knew my wife. Please, Sarah's voice cracked with emotion, I came here to help your daughters, that's all that matters right now. But Thomas said that's not all that matters, his voice rising, you lied to me, you stood in my house and pretended you didn't know my wife when you what, how did you know her, Tell me right now. I can't tell you yet, Sarah said desperately, and Thomas asked why not, and she said because if I do you'll send me away and your daughters need me, they really need me right now. The words hit Thomas like a punch because she was right, absolutely right. The twins had let Sarah in, and in 6 hours Sarah had done what 8 professionals couldn't do in 6 weeks of trying. But she had lied to him, and he had no idea what else she was hiding from him, or what her real reasons were for being here. 1 week, Thomas said with his voice cold and hard. You have 1 week like we agreed, but when it's over you're going to tell me everything, do you understand? And Sarah nodded with tears streaming down her face and said yes, and Thomas said everything, Sarah, who you are, how you knew Rachel, why you're really here, all of it. I will, Sarah promised. I'll tell you everything, I swear. And Thomas turned to walk away feeling angry and confused, but her voice stopped him at the doorway. Mr. Walker, Sarah called out, and he looked back at her, and she whispered with her voice breaking, your wife talked about you all the time, about how much she loved you, about how lucky she felt to have you as her husband. Thomas's throat closed up tight because Sarah was talking like she knew Rachel well, really well, and he said you're talking like you knew her personally. And Sarah wiped her eyes and said I did, better than you think. Then why won't you tell me the truth? Thomas asked, feeling hurt and confused. And Sarah admitted quietly because I'm scared you'll hate me when you know the truth about who I am. And before Thomas could respond or ask another question, Emma appeared in the doorway with her small voice worried, calling out Sarah, and asking are you leaving us too? And Sarah knelt down immediately and said no sweetheart, I'm staying, I promise you. Emma asked promise, and Sarah said I promise, I'm not going anywhere, I'm staying right here with you. And Emma ran to her and wrapped her arms around Sarah's neck tight, and Thomas watched this woman, this stranger who somehow wasn't a stranger at all, hold his daughter like she had been doing it her whole life, like she already knew exactly how tight Emma needed to be held to feel safe. Like she had learned it from someone who had held these girls before, someone like Rachel. Who was Sarah Miller really, and what was she so afraid to tell him that would make him hate her? Day 2 came and Thomas couldn't sleep again. Kept replaying Sarah's words in his mind. She talked about you all the time, past tense, like Sarah had sat with Rachel and had real conversations with her and knew her as a person. So he got up at 5 in the morning when the house was dark and quiet. Then he heard movement downstairs, so he walked down slowly and carefully and found Sarah in the kitchen making breakfast with her back to him, humming that song again while she cut fruit into small pieces. Thomas watched. Really watched carefully this time, and noticed the way she opened the cabinet on the left where Rachel kept the girls' special plates, and the way she cut strawberries into tiny pieces because Lily choked once on a big piece and Rachel never forgot, and always cut them small after that, and the way she arranged the fruit in a circle on the plate because Emma only ate food that looked pretty and organized. These were small things, tiny details, things a housekeeper wouldn't know, things a stranger couldn't guess. Things that only someone close to Rachel would know about. You know how they like their breakfast, Thomas said from the doorway, and Sarah jumped, nearly dropped the knife, turned around with her hand on her chest looking startled. Mr. Walker, she said breathing hard, I didn't hear you come down, and Thomas said you cut the strawberries small for Lily because she chokes, and Sarah's face went pale white. I just thought, she started to say, but Thomas interrupted and said and you put Emma's fruit in a circle because she won't eat it otherwise. How do you know these things? Sarah put down the knife and her hands were shaking badly now, and Thomas asked how long did you know my wife Sarah? But she didn't answer, just stood there with tears building in her eyes and threatening to spill over. Because you don't just know things about her, Thomas continued, his voice getting emotional, you know things about my daughters, things I never told you. Things no one would know unless, and his voice cracked, unless they had been here before, unless Rachel told them directly. Please, Sarah whispered, not yet, I'm not ready to tell you, but Thomas said my daughters are upstairs sleeping peacefully for the first time in 18 months and I don't even know who you really are, tell me the truth. Sarah wiped her eyes and said I'm someone who wants to help them more than anything, and Thomas said that's not enough anymore, I need to know. And Sarah said desperately it has to be enough for now, please trust me. Thomas stepped closer and asked were you Rachel's friend, and Sarah's breath hitched in her throat, and she looked at him with so much pain in her eyes it was hard to look at, and she finally whispered, "Yes, I was her friend, we were close." "How close?" Thomas asked, and Sarah said, "Very close, like sisters," and Thomas asked, "Then why lie? Why not tell me from the beginning who you were?" And Sarah's tears fell freely now as she said, "Because I was afraid you wouldn't let me stay if you knew the truth about me." "Knew what?" Thomas asked. "What truth?" But she shook her head and said, "I can't tell you yet, please understand." And Thomas said, "Please, Sarah." But she said desperately, "I need more time, your daughters are just starting to trust me. If I tell you everything now and you send me away it will destroy them completely, they'll think I abandoned them too just like everyone else." Thomas knew she was right and he hated that she was right because the girls needed her badly. So he said, 3 more days, then you tell me everything, and I mean everything, no more secrets." Sarah nodded, unable to speak because her throat was too tight with emotion, and Thomas turned to leave but paused at the doorway and said without looking back, "Rachel's best friend was named Sarah, she talked about her sometimes, said she was like a sister to her, the sister she never had growing up." Thomas didn't look back but he heard Sarah's sharp intake of breath, heard the sound of her sliding down to sit on the floor, heard her crying like someone who had been holding it in for far too long, for months and months of grief and guilt, and Thomas knew then. He knew who she was and what her connection to Rachel had been. What he didn't know yet was why she had stayed away for 18 months and why she had finally come back now. Day 3 came, and it was Wednesday afternoon, and Thomas left for an important board meeting at 1 o'clock even though he shouldn't have gone because something felt off, but he went anyway because work needed him. At 2:15 his phone buzzed with a security alert that someone had entered Rachel's study, and his heart stopped completely because that room had been locked for 18 months, and he was the only one with a key, and no one was supposed to go in there ever. It was like a shrine to Rachel that he couldn't bear to disturb. He left the meeting without any explanation, drove home faster than he should have, burst through the front door, and the house was too quiet, the wrong kind of quiet that meant something bad had happened. He took the stairs 2 at a time, and Rachel's study door stood wide open, and from inside he heard crying, not the twins' usual screaming but something deeper and more broken that scared him. Thomas reached the doorway and stopped breathing because the room was destroyed with curtains ripped down, picture frames knocked over, glass shattered across the floor. Rachel's jewelry box dumped out with pearls scattered everywhere like fallen tears, her books, the special leather ones she had collected since college, torn apart with pages ripped out and crumpled. And in the middle of it all sat Sarah on the floor with both twins in her lap, all 3 of them crying together, holding each other tight. "What happened?" Thomas asked, and his voice came out harder than he meant because he was shocked and hurt. And Sarah looked up with her face wet with tears but her eyes calm and peaceful. "The twins asked me about their mama," Sarah explained gently, "and I thought seeing her things might help them remember her in a good way. But I was wrong, I'm sorry." "You let them destroy everything," Thomas said, feeling his control cracking because these were the only things he had left of Rachel, actual physical things she had touched, and Sarah interrupted gently and said they didn't mean to destroy anything, Mr. Walker, they were looking for her. Trying to find her. Emma's tear-stained face turned to Thomas, and she said, "I'm sorry, Daddy. I was looking for Mama. Sarah said she wasn't here but I thought maybe she was just really, really good at hiding like when we play hide and seek," and her voice broke on the last word with a sob. Thomas's anger collapsed completely and disappeared because his 3-year-old daughter thought her mother was playing hide and seek. For 18 months she had been waiting for Rachel to jump out and say surprise. And Thomas sank to the floor beside Sarah, didn't care about his nice suit or the broken glass cutting into his knees, and reached for Emma's hand. "Baby girl," he said softly and gently, "Mama's not hiding anywhere, she's gone to heaven and she can't come back no matter how much we want her to, no matter how hard we wish and pray." "But why?" Lily demanded with her fists clenched tight. "We've been so good, we stopped crying at night so you could sleep, we tried really, really hard to be good girls. Why won't she come back if we're good now? Don't good girls get their mamas back?" The words destroyed Thomas completely, and he looked at Sarah feeling helpless because he didn't know what to say, and Sarah pulled both girls closer to her chest and said, "Your mama didn't leave because you were bad, she didn't leave because she wanted to. Sometimes terrible accidents happen and people we love die, and it's not fair and it's not our fault. It just is, and that's the hardest part. But loving people hurts when they leave, Emma whispered, and Sarah said with her voice breaking, yes it does. Loving people is the most beautiful and the most painful thing in the whole world. When we love someone and they die, it feels like part of us died too and left a hole inside. Is that how you feel? Lily asked while studying Sarah's face carefully. About your person who went away. Thomas's head snapped towards Sarah and he asked, what person are you talking about? And Sarah nodded slowly with tears streaming and said, yes, I lost two people I loved very, very much. My best friend and my little sister. They died in the same accident together. And for a long time I thought the hurt meant I should stop loving people, because if love hurts this much maybe it's not worth it. But I was wrong. It is worth it, Emma said quietly. Right. And Sarah's voice shook as she said, yes, sweetheart, yes it is. Even though it hurts so much I sometimes can't breathe or think straight, I would still choose to love them 1,000,000 times over, because the love is real and nothing, not even death, can take that love away from us or make it disappear. She looked at Thomas over the girls' heads and he saw it clearly now, the same grief he had been drowning in for 18 months, the same impossible pain that felt like it would never end. You lost someone in the same accident that took Rachel, Thomas said quietly, and it wasn't a question but a statement, and Sarah nodded, unable to speak because her throat was too tight. Who did you lose? Thomas whispered, and Sarah closed her eyes and fresh tears fell down her cheeks and she said, my little sister. She was only 16 years old. Rachel was driving her home from dance rehearsal that day. The room tilted and spun and Thomas breathed out Maya, remembering Rachel's young dance student, the talented one, and Sarah's face crumpled like paper. She was my whole world, Sarah said through sobs, my only family, and suddenly everything made sense to Thomas, all the pieces clicking into place like a puzzle. The grief in her eyes, the way she knew Rachel's songs and habits, why she had stayed away, why she had come back, it all made sense now. You were supposed to pick her up that day, Thomas said with his voice hollow and empty, and Sarah nodded while sobbing now, saying I was late. I was working on my homework for college, studying child psychology, and I lost track of time. At 5:15 Maya called and asked if Rachel could drive her home and I said yes without thinking. Thomas said stop. But his voice wasn't angry anymore, just broken and sad like hers, because he understood now, he understood everything. They sat there on the floor of Rachel's destroyed room, 4 people bound by the same terrible tragedy, and for the first time in 18 months Thomas wasn't alone in his grief, wasn't the only one carrying this unbearable weight. But one question still remained, one thing he needed to understand. Why had Sarah waited so long to come to them? Why now after all this time? They stayed on that floor for a long time with Thomas, Sarah, and the twins, surrounded by broken glass and scattered pearls and the pieces of a life that ended too soon, and finally Sarah spoke softly and said, we can't fix everything and make it perfect again, but we can gather up the pieces, we can keep the parts that still have love in them and honor them. Even the broken parts, Emma asked, and Sarah said especially the broken parts because they're part of the story too, they're part of what makes us who we are. So they spent the next hour together picking up torn pages and straightening frames, not trying to make everything perfect again because that was impossible, just making it whole enough to honor what had been and remember Rachel with love. When they finally stood up covered in dust and tears, Thomas looked at Sarah differently now, seeing her clearly for who she really was, and he said, I'm sorry about your sister, about Maya, about all of it, and Sarah wiped her eyes and said, I'm sorry too, for everything you've lost, for everything that was taken from all of us. That evening after the twins were finally in bed sleeping peacefully, Thomas found Sarah sitting in the kitchen in the dark, staring at nothing, just sitting there lost in thought and memory. He flipped on the light and she didn't look up, so he asked, can't sleep? And she shook her head and said, haven't slept well in 18 months, and Thomas pulled out a chair and sat across from her, and said, me either, I understand. They sat in silence for a while, not the uncomfortable kind of silence but the kind that happens between people who have survived the same terrible storm and understand each other without words. Why didn't you come sooner? Thomas finally asked. If you were Rachel's best friend, like a sister to her, why wait 18 months to help us? and Sarah's voice was barely a whisper as she said, because I blamed myself completely. I was supposed to pick Maya up at 5 o'clock exactly, but I was working on my homework, my big paper for college about child psychology, and I lost track of time because I was so focused. At 5:15 Maya called and asked if Rachel could drive her home, and I said yes without thinking about it, without realizing what I was asking Rachel to do. She looked at Thomas with devastated eyes full of pain and said if I had just been on time, if I had just looked at the clock and remembered, Rachel would still be alive, your daughters would still have their mother, Maya would still be dancing and going to high school. I destroyed everything. I destroyed all of your lives because I couldn't manage my time properly. Thomas reached across the table and took her hand gently and said, Sarah, you didn't fail anyone, a drunk driver did that. You made a normal decision, that's not your fault. That's just life being brutally unfair to all of us. Sarah's tears fell harder, and she said, you're kinder than I deserve. And Thomas said, I'm a father watching his daughter smile for the first time in 18 months. Whatever guilt brought you here, what keeps you here now is real. They need you and I need you too. Sarah looked up at him and something passed between them. Understanding and connection, and the beginning of something neither of them was ready to name yet, but it was there. 2 more days, Thomas said softly, then it's Christmas. Let's just focus on giving them one good holiday. One day where they remember what joy feels like again. Sarah nodded and said one good day, and they sat there in the quiet kitchen, 2 broken people trying to piece each other back together, and upstairs Emma lay awake with her ear pressed against the heating vent that carried voices from below, and she had heard everything they said. Tomorrow she would tell Lily, and together they would make sure Sarah never left them, because maybe, just maybe, their mama had sent her to save them after all. Day 5 came, and it was Christmas afternoon, and Thomas left the office at 3 o'clock because he couldn't concentrate on work, kept thinking about Sarah and about the twins and about how different the house felt now, like it was alive again. He drove home through streets decorated with lights and wreaths, with families walking together and children laughing, the world celebrating while he had spent 18 months learning how to breathe through pain. When he pulled into his driveway, he sat in the car for a moment, just sat there afraid to hope, afraid to believe things could actually be different and better now. Finally he got out, walked to his front door, and put his key in the lock, and the moment he stepped inside something felt different. The air was warmer and softer, like the house itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Then he heard it clearly, laughter, real laughter, not the manic kind that came before destruction, not fake or forced, just pure genuine joy, his daughters laughing like children who felt safe and loved. Thomas stood frozen in the hallway and his briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a thud, and he didn't pick it up, couldn't move because he hadn't heard that sound, hadn't heard his daughters laugh like children who felt safe in 18 whole months. The sound was coming from the living room, so he moved toward it slowly with each step feeling heavy like walking through water, and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears like drums. When he reached the doorway he stopped, and what he saw broke him completely in the best way possible, because Emma and Lily were sitting on the floor with Sarah, all 3 of them surrounded by Rachel's old Christmas decorations, the ones Thomas had packed away because looking at them hurt too much to bear. Sarah was holding up ornaments one by one and telling stories, and the twins were listening, actually listening with their faces soft and open and present instead of angry and closed off. This one, Sarah said gently while holding a small glass angel, your mama got this the year you were born. She hung it on the tree and prayed you'd always have angels watching over you and keeping you safe. Really? Emma's voice was full of wonder instead of pain, and Sarah promised really, I was there when she bought it. Lily reached for a wooden star and asked what about this one, and Sarah said that one your mama made herself with her own hands. See the little paint marks? She said it wasn't perfect, but that's what made it special. Perfect things don't need love, but imperfect things do. Thomas's throat closed up tight because those were Rachel's exact words, her philosophy about everything in life. Emma looked up and saw him standing there watching them, and she said, Daddy, you're home. And she jumped up and ran to him, actually ran toward him instead of away, and Thomas dropped to his knees and caught her and pulled her close to his chest. Then Lily was there too, wrapping her small arms around his neck tight, and Lily said excitedly, we're decorating for Christmas. Sarah's telling us stories about Mama, good stories, the kind that make us happy instead of sad. She said we can remember Mama without it hurting so much, Emma added. We just have to remember the love instead of the leaving, those are her words. Thomas looked over their heads at Sarah, who was still sitting on the floor holding that glass angel, with tears streaming down her face, and he asked her with his voice breaking, "How did you do this? How did you reach them when nobody else could?" Sarah wiped her eyes and said, "I just showed up every day. That's all scared children need, Mr. Walker. Someone who keeps showing up and doesn't leave them no matter what." Thomas couldn't hold it together anymore, and the tears came hard and fast. 18 months of grief and exhaustion and feeling like he was failing his daughters, all of it poured out at once, and he pulled the twins closer, buried his face in their hair, and wept like he hadn't wept since Rachel died. "Are you sad, Daddy?" Emma asked carefully, touching his wet cheek, and Thomas said, "No, baby, I'm happy, so happy, happier than I've been in so long." "Sometimes happy crying and sad crying look the same on the outside," Lily observed wisely. "Sarah taught us that. They're both just feelings that need to come out." "Of course she did," Thomas said with a small laugh through his tears. The twins wiggled out of his hug and went back to the decorations, started hanging ornaments on the small tree in the corner, the one Thomas had put up but couldn't bring himself to decorate because it hurt too much. Sarah stood up slowly and came over to where Thomas still knelt on the floor, and she whispered, "Your wife would be so proud of them, they're being so brave, braver than most adults I know." Thomas looked up at her, and said, "They're not the only brave ones, you're brave too, Sarah. So brave for coming here." Sarah helped him to his feet, and they stood there together watching the twins decorate the tree, with Emma showing Lily where each ornament should go, and Lily actually listening and following her sister's instructions, both of them talking about their mama without rage or denial, just love, pure simple love that would never die. "I don't want you to leave," Thomas said quietly so only Sarah could hear, and Sarah's breath caught, and she said, "What do you mean?" And Thomas said, "Tomorrow is your last day, your trial weekends, but I don't want you to go, please don't go." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears and she said, "Are you sure, even knowing what you know about me, even knowing I was there when Rachel," and Thomas interrupted her, and said, "Especially knowing that, because you understand them in a way no one else can, you've walked through the same fire we have." Day 7 came, and it was Christmas Eve morning, and Thomas woke up early to a house that was quiet and peaceful, a kind of quiet he had forgotten could exist, the good kind of quiet. He got dressed and went downstairs and found Sarah already in the kitchen making coffee like she did every morning, and she turned when she heard him and said morning softly, and he poured himself a cup and said morning back. "I can't believe it's been a week already." "Time moves different when you're healing," Sarah said with a sad smile. "Healing time goes faster than hurting time somehow." They stood there in comfortable silence drinking their coffee, and then Thomas heard footsteps upstairs, small feet running fast, and whispered voices talking in secret. He looked at Sarah confused and said, "They're up early." And Sarah said, "They've been planning something all week but they won't tell me what it is." The twins appeared in the doorway both fully dressed, both carrying their little suitcases with the princess stickers on them, and Thomas's heart stopped completely. "Girls," he said carefully, "what are you doing with those suitcases? Where are you going?" Lily set her suitcase down with a serious face and said, "We packed our stuff," and Thomas said, "I can see that, but why?" And Emma said simply, "Wherever Sarah goes we're going too, we already decided together." Thomas knelt down and said, "What do you mean?" And Lily explained like she was talking to someone who didn't understand. "Today is day 7, you said 1 week, if you make Sarah leave we're going with her, we already decided and packed." Emma added, "We talked about it, and we both agree, Sarah stays or we go, those are the only 2 choices." Thomas looked at these 2 3-year-old girls, babies who had spent 18 months pushing everyone away and hurting everyone who tried to help them, and now they were choosing someone, fighting for someone, ready to leave everything rather than lose her, and it should have hurt, should have felt like rejection of him, but instead Thomas felt something else, he felt hope and pride. Because his daughters were healing, learning to love again, learning to trust, and that was the only thing that truly mattered in the world. "Why, Sarah?" Thomas asked gently. "Tell me what makes her so different from everyone else who tried." Emma thought carefully and said, "She doesn't try to make us stop being sad, she's sad too, so she understands how it feels." The other babysitters told us to stop crying and be good, Lily said, but Sarah just sits with us until the crying stops by itself naturally. And she knew Mama, Emma continued. She tells us real true stories that make Mama feel close instead of far away and gone forever. She makes the house feel like home again, Lily whispered, like it did before. Thomas's eyes burned with tears and he looked at Sarah who was crying silently with her hand over her mouth. And he stood up and faced Sarah directly and said, "You're fired, Sarah," and Sarah's face fell apart. The twins gasped and grabbed each other's hands tight, and Emma said, "No, Daddy, please." But Thomas continued and said, "You're fired as the housekeeper because I'm offering you a different job instead, full-time caregiver for Emma and Lily, real salary, health insurance, your own room in this house, and a real place in this family if you want it, if you'll have us." The kitchen went completely silent for a long moment, and then Sarah started crying and laughing at the same time and said, "You scared me so badly." And Lily demanded Sarah say yes right now, and Emma whispered, "Please say yes, please, please stay with us forever." Sarah dropped to her knees and opened her arms wide, and both girls ran to her and wrapped themselves around her like they would never ever let go, and Sarah said into their hair, "Yes, yes, I'm staying, I'm not going anywhere ever, I promise you both." "Forever?" Emma asked, and Sarah promised, "Forever and ever, I'll be here as long as you need me and want me." Thomas watched them, his daughters and the woman who had saved them all, and he felt something he thought died with Rachel. He felt peace, real peace, the kind that doesn't mean the pain is gone completely but just that they had learned to carry it together as a family. That afternoon they went to Rachel's grave together, all four of them holding hands, and the twins brought flowers from the garden, purple and yellow ones because those were Rachel's favorite colors. Emma knelt beside the stone and said, "Hi Mama, it's us. We're okay now. Sarah's staying forever. She's teaching us how to remember you without it hurting so much inside. We still miss you every single day," Lily added, "but we're not scared anymore like we used to be, we know. You're watching us from heaven." Sarah placed her own flowers, white roses, and whispered, "I'm taking care of them just like I promised I would. They'll never forget you. I'll make absolutely sure of it." Thomas put his hand on Sarah's shoulder, and she leaned into him slightly. A small gesture, but it meant everything, and he said to the headstone, "Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for sending her to us when we needed her most." That evening they sat in the living room together with the crooked tree glowing softly and Christmas music playing quietly in the background, and the twins curled up on either side of Sarah, telling her what they wanted Santa to bring them for Christmas. Thomas watched from his chair, and for the first time in 18 months the house didn't feel like a tomb or a museum. It felt like a home, a real home with love and laughter and hope. Sarah looked over at him, and their eyes met, and something passed between them, understanding and gratitude, and the beginning of something neither of them was ready to name yet, but it was there, and it was real, and it was growing. Later, after the twins were finally asleep, Thomas found Sarah standing by the window looking out at the snow starting to fall like magic, and he said quietly, "Thank you for everything," and she turned and asked, "For what?" "For coming here, for staying, for loving them when no one else could reach them," Thomas said. "I didn't do it alone," Sarah said. "You showed up too, every single day even when it was hard, that matters just as much." Thomas stepped closer to her and said, "Rachel told you once, didn't she, that if anything happened to her she hoped I'd find love again?" And Sarah's eyes widened and she asked, "How did you know that?" "Because I know my wife," Thomas said, "and I know she would have wanted someone she trusted to watch over us. She sent you, didn't she? Not just for them but for me too." Sarah's tears fell and she said, "Rachel told me you had too much heart to spend your life alone. She said love has a way of finding people who need it most when they least expect it to come." "She was right," Thomas whispered, "about everything. She was always right." They stood there by the window with snow falling outside like a blessing, two people who had loved the same woman, who had lost everything, who had somehow found each other in the wreckage and learned that broken things can be made whole, not perfect, not the same as before, but whole in a new way, a way that honored what was lost while still choosing to live and love again. Upstairs, Emma and Lily slept peacefully for the first time in 18 months with no nightmares and no screaming, just rest and dreams, because they finally understood something their father and Sarah were still learning, that love doesn't end when someone dies, It just changes shape and finds new hands to hold and new hearts to fill and new ways to show up. And sometimes when you've lost all hope, when you think the darkness will never end, love walks through your door disguised as a stranger and reminds you that you were never alone. You were just waiting for grace to find you exactly where you were and teach you how to live again.